A cop walks into an orphanage searching for something, though he's not sure what. Then he hears it. No one ever picks them. He turns and sees them. Two fragile, white-haired children sitting in the shadows. Their eyes hold years of rejection, their small hands gripping onto each other as if bracing for the next goodbye. His heart clenches. He should walk away. He's not a father. But when one of them whispers, "Do we have to be good so you don't give us back?" He feels his world shatter. What made these children so unwanted? And why does he feel like in saving them, he's also saving himself? What happens next will bring him to his knees and change all their lives forever. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. The winter morning crept through Ben Carter's bedroom window, casting long shadows across the hardwood floor. He lay in bed, staring at the empty space beside him where Sarah used to sleep. The sheets were cold and neat, undisturbed on her side, just as they had been for the past 18 months. The pillow still held a slight indentation, a ghostly reminder of where her head once rested each night. The alarm clock's harsh buzz filled the room. Ben reached over and silenced it with a practiced motion, his hand finding the button without needing to look. 6:30 a.m., another Sunday, another day of going through the motions of pretending everything was fine. His feet touched the cold floor, and he shuffled toward the bathroom, passing Sarah's favorite chair in the hallway. The lavender candle she loved still sat on the side table, unlit but holding on to its faint scent. Her knitted blanket lay perfectly folded over the armrest, collecting dust like everything else in the house. He couldn't bring himself to move any of it, as if disturbing these items would somehow erase the last traces of her presence. In the kitchen, Ben's hands moved automatically through the familiar routine. Coffee grounds into filter, water into machine. Press start. The quiet gurgling of the coffee maker was the only sound in the empty house, competing with the steady tick-tock of the wall clock Sarah had picked out years ago. She'd loved it for its simple face and gentle chime on the hour. With coffee in hand, Ben settled into his study. His Bible lay open on the desk where he'd left it the night before, its pages thin and delicate beneath his fingertips. The words blurred before his eyes as he tried to focus on the morning's sermon notes. "Faith moves mountains," he'd written at the top of the page. The irony wasn't lost on him. His own mountain seemed immovable these days. Hours later, Ben stood at the pulpit of First Baptist Church, his voice steady and clear as he delivered his sermon to the familiar faces of his congregation. Mrs. Henderson sat in her usual spot, nodding along, her silver hair catching the light from the stained glass windows. The Wilson family filled their entire pew, their youngest trying not to fidget while their oldest pretended to take notes. "Trust in the Lord with all your heart," Ben recited, the words feeling like sand in his mouth. "And lean not on your own understanding." Each phrase felt hollow, echoing in his chest where faith used to reside. He wondered if anyone could hear the emptiness behind his words, the doubt that crept into every syllable. After the service, he managed a few quick nods and half smiles, avoiding the usual post-sermon conversations. His shoulders tensed with each approaching parishioner. "Just feeling a bit under the weather," he murmured to those who tried to engage him. The lie came easily now, practiced over months of dodging concerned parishioners who meant well, but whose sympathy he couldn't bear. Outside, the winter air bit at his cheeks, drawing color into his pale face. Ben turned left instead of right, taking an unfamiliar route home. His shoes crunched on the frozen ground as he passed the old Mason Street Orphanage, its red brick facade weathered and institutional. Dead vines clung to the walls like skeletal fingers reaching toward the gray sky. Two women stood near the entrance, their voices carrying in the still winter air. They wore the navy blue uniforms of the orphanage staff, huddled together against the cold, their breath visible in the frigid morning. "Those twins, the ones that came in last month," one said, shaking her head, her voice heavy with concern. "Nobody's even asked about them." "Poor things," the other replied, pulling her coat tighter around her shoulders. "Nobody wants to take on two at once, especially not at their age. Such a shame." Ben's steps slowed, then stopped. His breath formed small clouds in the frigid air as the women's words echoed in his mind. Twins. No one wants. Something stirred in his chest, an unfamiliar sensation, like a door creaking open after being locked for too long. The feeling caught him off guard, making his heart beat a little faster. He found himself standing at the orphanage's iron gate, his hands gripping the cold metal. Through the bars, he could see children's toys scattered across a small playground, their bright colors muted by winter's gray palette. A red ball lay forgotten near a swing set that creaked softly in the wind. The building loomed before him, windows like eyes staring back at his unexpected presence, each pane reflecting the weak winter sunlight. The ticking clock of his empty house seemed very far away now, as he stood there in the cold, unable to move, unable to leave. For the first time in 18 months, the comfortable numbness of his routine had cracked, letting something else seep in, something that felt dangerously close to purpose. His fingers tightened on the gate as an unexpected warmth spread through his chest, melting something frozen deep inside. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the cracked concrete path leading to the orphanage. Ben Carter stood at the iron gate, his breath visible in the cold air, forming small clouds that dissipated in the bitter wind. The building loomed before him, its weathered facade telling stories of years of neglect and too many tight budgets. Peeling paint curled away from wooden siding like old scabs, and empty swing sets creaked in the winter wind, their chains rusted and forgotten, a silent testament to countless children who had come and gone. His hand rested on the gate latch, fingers trembling slightly against the cold metal, but he couldn't bring himself to push it open. What was he doing here? He had a sermon to prepare for next Sunday, papers to grade for his weekly Bible study, and a dozen other tasks demanding his attention. Yet those words, "Twins no one wants," echoed in his mind, refusing to let him walk away, tugging at something deep inside him he thought had died with Sarah. Finally, his feet carried him up the worn steps to the front door. Each board groaned beneath his weight, as if questioning his presence, the sound amplified by the stillness of the winter afternoon. Before he could change his mind, before doubt could take hold completely, he pressed the doorbell, its harsh buzz cutting through the quiet. Heavy footsteps approached from inside, and the door opened to reveal Mrs. Grady, a woman he recognized from town but had never properly met. Her gray hair was pulled back in a tight bun, and deep lines around her eyes spoke of both kindness and weariness, the mark of someone who had seen too many children's hopes dashed. Recognition flickered across her face, followed quickly by suspicion, her lips pressing into a thin line. "Reverend Carter?" She adjusted her glasses, studying him with the careful scrutiny of a protective guardian. "This is unexpected. We don't usually get visitors on Sundays." "Mrs. Grady," Ben cleared his throat, suddenly aware of how unprepared he was for this moment. I overheard something about twins?" Her expression hardened slightly, a shield coming up. "Did the church send you? Because if this is about charity—" No, Ben interrupted, feeling increasingly foolish under her stern gaze. I heard someone mention them, and I felt—" He trailed off, unable to explain the pull he'd felt, the inexplicable need to come here today. Mrs. Grady's eyes softened slightly, but wariness remained, like a well-worn coat she couldn't shed. "The twins have been through enough disappointment, Reverend. People come, see their condition, and leave. I won't have them hurt again, not these two." "Their condition?" She sighed, then stepped aside, her movements heavy with resignation. "Perhaps you should see for yourself. Though I warn you, if you're only here out of pity, please leave now. These children deserve better than that." The hallway she led him through was clean but dim, lined with small beds and well-worn toys that spoke of limited resources but abundant care. Their footsteps echoed against linoleum floors as she spoke quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. Mia and Max were abandoned at birth. Their albinism. She paused, old anger coloring her tone. "Some called it a curse. They've been here 7 years now. 5 potential adoptions, all fallen through. each one harder than the last. They stopped outside a small room. Through the doorway, Ben saw two small figures, like twin ghosts in the afternoon light. The girl, Mia, sat straight-backed in a wooden chair, her white blonde hair almost luminescent in the afternoon light, falling past her shoulders in neat braids. Her pale blue eyes met his with an intensity that made him want to look away, but he held her gaze. There was intelligence there, sharp and assessing, and beneath it, a deep, carefully hidden pain that seemed too heavy for such small shoulders. Beside her, Max clutched a stuffed rabbit that had seen better days, its fur matted and worn from years of desperate comfort. His knuckles were white against the toy's gray fabric, betraying his anxiety. Unlike his sister, he didn't meet Ben's eyes, instead watching him from beneath long white lashes, ready to disappear at the first sign of rejection. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken fears and expectations. Ben saw it in their posture, in the way Mia's shoulders tensed and Max pressed closer to his sister, their bodies angled toward each other like magnetic poles. They were waiting for him to turn away just like everyone else had, their disappointment already rehearsed and ready. Something in Ben's chest tightened painfully, a familiar ache he knew too well. He recognized that look, that anticipation of rejection, that careful guard against hope. He'd seen it in his own mirror every morning since Sarah died, since he lost her and their unborn child, since his world had shattered into pieces he still couldn't put back together. The overhead lamp buzzed softly in Mrs. Grady's office, casting a warm but dim light across the worn furniture. Ben sat in an old armchair, its cushions flattened from years of anxious visitors, the faded fabric telling stories of countless meetings just like this one. Mrs. Grady settled behind her desk, adjusting a stack of manila folders with practiced movements. The twins had been taken to the playroom, but their presence lingered in Ben's mind, those matching sets of pale eyes haunting his thoughts. Most people, Mrs. Grady began, her weathered hands folding together on the scratched desktop, they take one look at them and decide it's too much. The albinism scares them. They worry about medical issues, special needs. She paused, watching Ben's reaction carefully, her eyes sharp with years of experience reading potential parents. But that's not even the hardest part. Ben leaned forward, his throat tight with emotion. What happened to them? Their mother abandoned them at birth. In her culture, she believed they were cursed. Mrs. Grady's voice grew heavy with remembered pain. Since then, it's been one foster home after another. 5 homes in 7 years. Each time they're sent back for different reasons, too quiet, too difficult, too damaged. She spat the last word like it tasted bitter, her lips pressing into a thin line. Ben's hands clenched in his lap, knuckles whitening. He thought of his empty house, of the nursery he'd painted yellow 7 years ago, the one that had never held a baby. His wife had been so excited about the color, saying it was perfect for any child. The memory of her joy made his chest ache. Mia's the protector, Mrs. Grady continued, her tone softening with admiration. She doesn't let anyone close to Max, doesn't trust adults. Can't blame her, really. Max, he's gentler, more willing to trust, but that makes the rejections harder on him. They're both so used to being sent away that they pack their bags at the smallest sign of trouble. Even a raised voice can send them scrambling for their belongings. The weight of their pain settled on Ben's shoulders like a physical burden. He saw himself in their eyes, that same lost look he saw in the mirror every morning, that expectation that happiness would always be just out of reach. Their suffering called to something deep within him. "I should warn you," Mrs. Grady said, her voice softening with concern. "They won't make it easy. They'll test you, push you away before you can reject them. Are you ready for that kind of challenge? Being a single father to 2 traumatized children isn't something to take lightly. They need someone who won't give up when things get hard." Ben stood up slowly, his decision already made in his heart, feeling more certain than he had about anything in years. "Can I see them again?" Mrs. Grady led him to the playroom where Mia and Max sat exactly as they had before. Mia's thin fingers worried the hem of her sweater, pulling at a loose thread, her pale face unreadable but her shoulders tense with anticipation. Max clutched his stuffed rabbit closer, its worn fur matted from years of anxious holding. as if it could shield him from another disappointment. Ben knelt down in front of them, his heart pounding against his ribs. He saw their fear, their resignation, their certainty that he would walk away like everyone else. Instead, he whispered two simple words that would change all their lives. "I pick you." The words hung in the air between them like a bridge waiting to be crossed. Mia's expression didn't change, but something flickered in her eyes, a tiny spark of possibility she couldn't quite suppress. Max's grip on his rabbit loosened just slightly, and he glanced at his sister, waiting for her reaction as he always did. Neither child spoke, but in that moment of suspended silence, a fragile, cautious hope began to take root, delicate as the first green shoot breaking through winter soil. Morning light filtered through the dusty blinds of Mrs. Grady's office, casting thin stripes across the adoption papers spread on her desk. Ben's hand hovered over the documents, pen trembling slightly. The weight of what he was about to do pressed down on his shoulders, not with doubt, but with the enormous responsibility of it all. This was the moment that would change everything, transform 3 broken pieces into something whole. Mrs. Grady sat across from him, her reading glasses perched on her nose as she pointed to each line requiring his signature. "Initial here, full signature there," she instructed softly, aware of the gravity of the moment. Her weathered fingers traced each blank space with practiced care. The twins sat in mismatched chairs against the wall, their pale faces solemn in the morning light. Max hugged his stuffed rabbit, occasionally stealing glances at the papers, his small fingers working nervously through the toy's worn fur, while Mia sat ramrod straight, her pale hands folded tightly in her lap, knuckles white with tension. Neither had spoken a word all morning, the silence heavy with anticipation and uncertainty. "This section acknowledges that you understand their medical needs," Mrs. Grady continued, tapping the page with her pen. "Regular checkups, sun protection. Their albinism requires special care. You'll need to be diligent about dermatologist appointments and proper eye care." Ben nodded, signing his name. Each stroke of the pen felt monumental, like he was writing not just his name but a promise, a covenant to protect these children, to give them the home they deserved. His signature flowed across the paper, steady despite his trembling heart. "And here," Mrs. Grady pointed, her voice gentling further, "this makes it official. They'll be legally yours, your family." Ben's hand moved to sign, but a small tug at his sleeve made him pause. He turned to find Mia standing beside him, her blue eyes intense and searching, filled with a wisdom no child should have to possess. Her voice, when it came, was barely above a whisper, fragile as spun glass. "Do we have to be good so you don't give us back?" The pen slipped from Ben's fingers, clattering on the desk with a sound that seemed to echo in the sudden stillness. His heart clenched so tight he could barely breathe. 7 years old, and she was already expecting conditions for being loved, already preparing for rejection. He blinked hard, fighting back tears that threatened to spill, his throat tight with unspeakable emotion. Max watched from his chair, clutching his rabbit tighter against his chest like a shield, waiting for the answer as anxiously as his sister. Their faces held the same look, hope warring with experience, wanting to believe but afraid to trust. Years of disappointment had taught them to expect the worst while desperately wishing for the best. Ben had to swallow twice before he could speak. When he did, his voice was rough with emotion, but firm with conviction. "You don't have to earn the right to stay," he said softly, meeting each child's eyes in turn. "You're not on trial. This is forever. No matter what happens, no matter what you do, this is your home now." Mia's expression didn't change, but her fingers remained twisted in his sleeve as he picked up the pen again. He signed the final paper with deliberate care, making it official. They were his children now. The ink seemed to shine in the striped morning light, a testament to new beginnings. Mrs. Grady gathered the documents with gentle hands, her own eyes suspiciously bright behind her glasses. "Congratulations," she said warmly, her smile genuine and touched with joy. "You're a family." Ben stood up slowly, his heart pounding with the reality of what he'd just done. He held out his hand, palm up. An invitation, not a demand, letting them choose to trust. Max hesitated for a long moment, studying Ben's open hand as if reading a map to safety, before sliding his small hand into Ben's. His grip was tentative, but real. Mia took a step back, watching them both carefully, measuring every movement. As they walked toward the door, she followed a step behind, not quite ready to reach out, but not running away either. It was a beginning, small and fragile as a newly sprouted seed, but it was real. Ben's hand trembled slightly as he turned the key in the lock. The porch light cast long shadows across the welcome mat, a mat his wife had chosen years ago, its faded welcome home message a bittersweet reminder of happier times. Behind him, Mia and Max stood perfectly still, their small frames rigid with uncertainty. Each child held a plastic bag containing everything they owned in the world, the thin material crinkling softly in the evening breeze. "This is home now," Ben said softly, pushing the door open. The warm air rushed out to meet them, carrying the lingering scent of vanilla from an old candle and the mustiness of unused spaces. The entryway light flickered to life as he reached for the switch. "Would you like to come in?" Neither child moved. Max's knuckles were white around his stuffed rabbit, the worn toy dangling limply from his grip, while Mia's sharp eyes darted everywhere, taking in the exits, the windows, the layout. She was mapping escape routes, Ben realized. He recognized the look. It was the same one he'd worn after Sarah died, always searching for an escape from pain that couldn't be outrun. "It's okay," he assured them, keeping his voice gentle, careful not to make any sudden movements. "Take your time." Finally, Max took a tiny step forward, then another, his sock-covered feet barely making contact with the floor. Mia followed, staying close to her brother, one hand hovering near his shoulder. Their footsteps were silent on the hardwood floors, as if they were trying to leave no trace of their presence, like they'd done so many times before. The living room felt different with them in it. Bigger somehow, yet more confined. The familiar space transformed by their presence. The old grandfather clock ticked steadily in the corner, marking each second of their shared discomfort. Dust motes danced in the lamplight, highlighting the stillness of the scene. Ben's throat tightened as he watched them stand there, two small figures looking lost in the middle of his living room, their shadows stretching long against the wall. "Would you like to see your room?" he asked, gesturing toward the stairs with what he hoped was an encouraging smile. "It's just up here." They followed him up the creaking steps, Mia counting each one under her breath, 1 through 14, a habit born of necessity to know every detail of her surroundings. Ben led them to the spare room he'd hastily prepared that morning, his attempts at making it welcoming now seeming woefully inadequate. 2 twin beds with matching blue blankets stood against opposite walls, their fresh sheets still showing crisp hospital corners. A small bookshelf held some old children's books and a few toys he'd found in the attic, carefully cleaned and arranged. The dresser was empty, waiting to be filled, its pine surface gleaming with fresh polish, emphasized the word together, knowing from their file how important it was that they weren't separated. Max's eyes widened slightly at the sight of the beds, a flicker of longing crossing his face before disappearing behind careful neutrality. But neither child moved from the doorway. They stood shoulder to shoulder, their bags still clutched tightly in their hands like shields against the unknown. "The dresser is empty," Ben continued, opening a drawer to show them. The wood slid smoothly on its tracks, the fresh liner paper crinkling softly. "And there's space in the closet for your things." He pointed to the small closet door, its brass handle recently polished. "Would you like to put your clothes away?" Silence answered him. Max's rabbit was pressed so tightly against his chest that its worn ears flopped forward, nearly touching his chin. Mia's face remained carefully blank, a mask she'd perfected over years of foster homes, but her eyes never stopped moving, cataloging every detail of the room as if searching for hidden dangers. "That's okay," Ben said, trying to hide his disappointment behind a gentle smile. "We can do that tomorrow. Are you hungry? I could make some sandwiches." He thought of the fresh bread and cold cuts he'd bought that morning, sitting untouched in the kitchen. Two small heads shook in unison, a synchronized movement that spoke of long practice. "All right then. Well, it's getting late. Maybe you'd like to get some sleep?" He gestured to the beds, their plump pillows and thick comforters promising comfort that the children seemed unable to trust. "You must be tired." Neither child moved toward the beds. They remained frozen in the doorway, as if crossing the threshold would make everything too real, would somehow seal their fate in this new place that couldn't possibly be permanent. "I'll leave the door open a bit," Ben said, stepping back into the hallway. "My room is just down the hall if you need anything. Anything at all." He gestured to his door, making sure they could see exactly where to find him. He retreated slowly, his heart heavy as he watched them standing there, still clutching their bags, still not believing this was real. Later that night, when he checked on them, the beds were untouched, their pristine surfaces a stark reminder of his failed attempts at welcome. Instead, he found them huddled together in the corner, their backs against the wall, whispering softly to each other in the darkness. Max's rabbit was sandwiched between them, and their plastic bags served as pillows, the same way they must have slept in countless other strange rooms. Ben stood in the doorway, feeling the weight of their distrust like a physical pain in his chest. The moonlight streaming through the window illuminated their white blonde hair, making them look like two small ghosts haunting the corner of their new room. Their breaths came soft and even, but he noticed how Mia's body was curved protectively around her brother, even in sleep, ready to shield him from whatever dangers the night might bring. The first rays of sunlight crept through the kitchen windows as Ben measured coffee grounds into the filter. He'd barely slept, listening all night for any sound from the children's room. His movements were careful and deliberate as he pulled eggs from the refrigerator and dropped bread into the toaster. The familiar routine helped steady his nerves, giving his restless hands something to do. The aroma of coffee and toast filled the house, wrapping the kitchen in a warm, homey scent. Ben hoped it might coax the twins downstairs, though he knew better than to expect too much too soon. He'd heard them whispering late into the night, their voices too soft to make out the words, but the anxiety in their tone had been clear enough. When quiet footsteps finally reached his ears, Ben kept his eyes on the scrambled eggs he was preparing. He didn't want to startle them. Max appeared first, followed closely by Mia. They stood in the doorway, still wearing yesterday's clothes, looking like they might bolt at any second. Their white blonde hair was slightly rumpled from sleep, making them appear even younger and more vulnerable. "Good morning," Ben said softly, keeping his tone light and warm. "I made breakfast. Would you like to sit down?" He gestured to the kitchen table, where he'd already set out plates, silverware, and cheerful yellow napkins. The twins exchanged glances before Max took a tentative step forward. Mia followed, her face carefully blank, but her eyes darted around the kitchen, mapping exits. They perched on the edge of their chairs like birds ready to take flight, their feet barely touching the floor. Ben set plates in front of them, scrambled eggs, buttered toast, and small glasses of orange juice. He sat down with his own plate, deliberately focusing on his food rather than watching them. From the corner of his eye, he saw Max's small hand dart out, quickly stuffing a piece of toast into his pocket. Then another. The boy's movements were practiced, automatic, the habit of someone used to not knowing when their next meal would come. Each furtive motion made Ben's chest tighten with sadness. "It's going to be a nice day," Ben commented, stirring his coffee and watching the cream create swirling patterns. "The sun's coming out. Maybe we could take a walk later, see the neighborhood. There's a nice park just down the street." Mia sat rigidly in her chair, staring at her untouched plate like it might be a trap. When Ben gently suggested she try the eggs, she pushed the plate away, her pale fingers leaving smudges on the ceramic. Her jaw was set in a determined line that reminded him of a much older person. The kitchen clock ticked loudly in the silence, marking each tense moment. Ben continued eating, talking softly about nothing in particular. The weather, the birds he'd seen at the feeder, the way the morning light made patterns on the wall. He kept his movements slow and predictable, hoping to show them there was nothing to fear here. Each word was chosen carefully, like stepping stones across a stream. Max's pockets bulged with hidden bread, creating obvious lumps in his oversized t-shirt. Crumbs fell onto his chair and the floor around him, but he didn't seem to notice, too focused on securing what food he could. Ben's heart ached at the sight, but he knew drawing attention to it would only make things worse. He remembered what the social worker had told him about food insecurity, about how it could take months or even years for children to feel secure enough to trust that meals would always be available. Instead, he reached for a clean napkin and placed it quietly beside Max's plate. The boy's hands froze mid-motion, but Ben just continued talking about the squirrel he'd seen in the backyard yesterday, describing its acrobatic attempts to raid the bird feeder. Max's shoulders remained tense, his eyes fixed on his lap, while more toast disappeared into his pockets. Across the table, Mia watched everything, her blue eyes taking in every detail, every movement, studying Ben like she was trying to solve a complicated puzzle. Her gaze was unnervingly mature, weighing and measuring his every action. The silence felt heavy, too big for the small kitchen. Ben kept his voice gentle and steady, filling the quiet with soft words, hoping that somehow they would begin to understand that this home, this family, could be different from what they'd known before. He silently prayed for the patience and wisdom to help these wounded children find their way to trust. The first few days as a father felt like walking through a minefield for Ben. Every action, every word seemed to carry the weight of potential disaster. He'd never realized how many ways he could mess up simple tasks until he had 2 pairs of watchful eyes following his every move, scrutinizing each gesture as if searching for hidden meaning. Tuesday morning found him standing over a smoking pan of burnt pancakes, the acrid smell filling the kitchen and seeping into the living room beyond. Max had quietly mentioned liking them the day before, his first voluntary statement since arriving, and the memory of that tiny whisper had filled Ben with determination. He had woken up early, determined to make the perfect breakfast, only to ruin 3 batches in a row, each attempt more discouraging than the last. "I'm not very good at this yet," he admitted, scraping blackened batter into the trash. The twins sat at the table, neither speaking, but their usual tension seemed slightly lessened. Ben could have sworn he saw Max's lips twitch, just slightly, a ghost of amusement dancing across his face. Wednesday wasn't much better. He'd bought oranges, forgetting Max's grimace when offered one earlier in the week. The bowl of oatmeal he placed in front of Mia went untouched. He later noticed her eyeing the cereal box in the pantry, her gaze lingering on the colorful cardboard with poorly concealed longing. "You can have cereal instead," he said softly, careful to keep his voice gentle and free of judgment. She didn't respond, but the next morning he made sure to put the cereal box on the table first thing, along with 3 bowls and a pitcher of cold milk. The worst moment came Thursday afternoon. Ben had been hanging a picture in the hallway, trying to make the house feel more like a home, less like the temporary stop he feared the children still considered it. He turned quickly, hammer still in hand, not realizing Mia was right behind him. Her reaction was instant. She flinched and backed away, arms raised slightly as if expecting a blow, her pale face tight with fear. The hammer clattered to the carpet. Ben's stomach churned as he watched her scurry away, her footsteps quick and silent on the carpet. What had happened to make such a young child expect violence? The thought kept him awake that night, surrounded by parenting books borrowed from the library, their pages dog-eared and marked with sticky notes. Trauma responses in children, building trust, establishing safety. He muttered, highlighting passages and making notes until his fingers were stained yellow. His eyes burned from exhaustion, but he couldn't stop reading. Each page revealed how much he didn't know, how much he needed to learn, how far he had to go to become the father these children deserved. Every night, his routine ended the same way. He'd check on the twins, heart heavy as he found them still huddled together in the corner of their room, despite the comfortable beds just feet away. They slept back to back, Max clutching his rabbit like a lifeline, Mia positioned slightly in front, as if protecting her brother even in sleep, her small body a shield against the world. Standing in their doorway that night, Ben whispered into the darkness, "I'll get this right. I promise." The words felt inadequate against the magnitude of their trauma, but he meant them with every fiber of his being, a vow as sacred as any he'd ever made from his pulpit. The living room was enveloped in a peaceful silence, save for the occasional frustrated sigh from Ben as he wrestled with the broken table lamp. Despite checking the bulb, the issue seemed to lie deeper within, and his clumsy fingers struggled to pinpoint the problem. The dim overhead light cast long, pensive shadows across the carpet as the evening settled in. "Come on," Ben muttered, turning the lamp base over in his hands, his fingers fumbling with the tiny screws. He needed a smaller screwdriver, but he was reluctant to leave the living room and disrupt the fragile sense of comfort the twins had found. Max curled up in an armchair, clutching his beloved stuffed rabbit, while Mia perched on the edge of the couch, both of them pretending not to watch Ben's efforts. Accidentally setting the lamp down harder than intended, Ben winced as Max jumped slightly at the sound. "Sorry," he said softly, making sure to keep his movements slow and deliberate, conscious of not startling the children. He was about to give up when he noticed soft footsteps approaching. From the corner of his eye, he saw Mia standing beside him, her thin arm extended, holding the exact screwdriver he needed in her small hand. Ben's heart swelled with emotion and he held his breath, afraid any sudden movement might cause Mia to retreat. Carefully, he reached out and took the tool. "Thank you, Mia," he whispered, his voice tinged with gratitude and awe. Mia remained silent, but she didn't leave. Instead, she stood there watching intently as Ben used her screwdriver to open the lamp's base. The dim light caught the silver sheen of her pale hair, and Ben could feel her studying his every move with a curious, yet less suspicious gaze than before. The silence between them felt different now, less heavy, less afraid. As Ben finally got the lamp working again, the warm glow filling the room, he said softly, "We did it," including Mia in the small victory. Though her expression didn't change, she lingered a moment longer before walking back to her spot on the couch. Later that night, as Ben made his usual rounds to check on the twins before bed, he paused in their doorway. "Good night," he said, as he did every night, expecting the usual silence in return. But this time, Max's small voice whispered back, "Good night." Ben's throat tightened with emotion, and he stood there a moment longer watching their small forms huddled together in their corner. They still wouldn't sleep in the beds, but something had shifted today. A tiny, precious flower pushing through the frozen ground. Lying in his own bed, Ben stared up at the shadows dancing on his ceiling, holding these small victories close to his heart. The twins were starting to believe in him, even if just a little. It wasn't much, but it was a beginning, a glimmer of hope that his efforts were slowly chipping away at the walls they had built to protect themselves. The house was silent, except for the steady tick-tock of the old grandfather clock in the hallway, its measured rhythm marking time in the darkness. Ben lay in his bed staring at the ceiling, his mind drifting between sleep and wakefulness. The wind outside rustled through bare winter branches, creating shadows that danced across his bedroom wall like ghostly fingers. Then he heard it, so faint at first he thought he was dreaming. A soft, gentle humming floated through the darkness, threading its way through the quiet house. The melody tugged at his heart, familiar yet distant, like a half-remembered dream from childhood. Ben sat up slowly, his breath catching in his throat. The humming continued, drifting down the hallway like a whisper carried on a breeze. He pushed back his covers and stepped onto the cold wooden floor, following the sound that pulled him forward like an invisible string. As he approached the twins' room, the melody became clearer, crystallizing into something that made his heart nearly stop. The tune. He knew it. Every note, every gentle rise and fall, every delicate pause. It was Sarah's lullaby, the one she had sung countless times while cradling her growing belly, dreaming of the baby they'd never meet, planning for a future that dissolved like morning mist. The door was slightly ajar, and pale moonlight spilled through the window, casting a silver glow across the room that made everything seem otherworldly. Ben peered inside, his hand gripping the doorframe for support, afraid his knees might give way. Mia sat cross-legged on Max's bed, her white blonde hair almost glowing in the moonlight like a halo. Max curled against her side, his stuffed rabbit clutched tightly to his chest, his face peaceful in sleep. His sister's thin fingers stroked his hair as she hummed, her voice pure and sweet in the darkness, filling the room with gentle comfort. Ben stood transfixed, barely daring to breathe. How did she know this song? The same melody, the same gentle cadence that Sarah had loved so much. Tears pricked at his eyes as memories washed over him. Sarah, sitting in the nursery they'd painted together, humming this very tune while folding tiny clothes they'd never use, her face glowing with hope and joy. A floorboard creaked under his weight, breaking the spell, and Mia's humming stopped abruptly. Her body went rigid, her hand freezing mid-stroke in Max's hair. Her eyes, wide and alert, found Ben's in the darkness. She looked like a deer caught in headlights, waiting for punishment or harsh words, her shoulders tensing as if preparing to shield her brother. Ben's throat felt tight as he slowly knelt beside the bed, keeping his movements gentle and deliberate, trying to appear as non-threatening as possible. "That was beautiful," he whispered, his voice rough with emotion and unshed tears. Mia didn't move or speak, but she held his gaze, her pale eyes reflecting the moonlight. For the first time since they'd arrived, she didn't look away or try to hide. In the moonlight, he could see something different in her eyes. Not quite trust, but perhaps the beginning of understanding, a tiny crack in the wall she'd built around herself. Sunlight filtered through the kitchen curtains, casting a warm glow across the counter where Ben stood flipping pancakes. The butter sizzled softly in the pan, and the rich scent of maple syrup filled the air. His movements were careful, deliberate. He'd burned 3 batches yesterday, but today he was determined to get it right. He'd spent half an hour watching cooking videos online last night, memorizing the exact moment when the tiny bubbles meant it was time to flip. The wooden floor creaked behind him. Max shuffled into the kitchen, his white blonde hair sticking up in all directions, still clutching his stuffed rabbit. His eyes were heavy with sleep as he rubbed them with his free hand, his dinosaur pajamas wrinkled from a night of restless turning. "Uncle Ben, can I have pancakes?" The words came out in a drowsy mumble, barely above a whisper. Ben's hand froze mid-flip, his heart skipping a beat. Uncle Ben. Not just you or silence, but Uncle Ben. He swallowed hard, forcing his movements to stay casual, natural. "Don't make a big deal of it," he told himself. "Don't scare him away." He'd been waiting weeks for any sign that the children were beginning to accept him. "Sure, kiddo," he managed, his voice steady despite the emotion threatening to crack it. He slid a golden brown pancake onto a plate, adding an extra drizzle of syrup. He'd noticed Max had a sweet tooth. The boy's face always lit up at the sight of anything sugary, though he tried to hide his excitement. At the table, Mia sat perfectly still, her fork gripped tightly in her small hand. Her eyes darted between Ben and Max, analyzing every movement, every word, like a tiny sentinel on guard duty. Her own plate sat untouched, but she hadn't pushed it away this time. The steam rose from her pancakes in delicate wisps. Max climbed onto his chair, the stuffed rabbit settling in his lap. The kitchen filled with the quiet sounds of breakfast, forks against plates, the soft sip of milk, the gentle scrape of the spatula. For the first time, they were all eating together, like a real family. The morning sunlight caught the dust motes dancing in the air, making everything feel somehow softer, more peaceful. Ben kept cooking, his back turned to hide the smile he couldn't quite suppress. His hands trembled slightly as he poured more batter into the pan. Uncle Ben. The words echoed in his mind, warming him more than the morning sun streaming through the window. He'd never realized 2 simple words could mean so much. When the last pancake was done, Ben joined them at the table. Max was already halfway through his stack, syrup dripping down his chin. Even Mia had taken a few small bites, though she still watched Ben from the corner of her eye, her posture rigid but not quite as defensive as usual. After breakfast, Ben stood at the sink, warm water running over his hands as he washed the dishes. His chest felt tight, but in a good way, like his heart was too full to contain everything he was feeling. He wasn't their father, not yet, maybe not for a long time. But Uncle Ben, that was something. That was a start. A foundation they could build on, one pancake breakfast at a time. Sunlight streamed through the living room windows, casting warm patches on the hardwood floor. Ben had scattered art supplies across the coffee table, colored pencils, fresh erasers, and a brand new sketch pad. He'd gone to the store specifically to choose them, making sure to get the soft-core pencils that would blend easily. He'd noticed how Mia's eyes always traced patterns, following the swirls in the wallpaper or studying the way shadows fell across the floor. She noticed things others missed, and he wanted to give her a way to express what she saw. Mia sat cross-legged on the floor, her pale fingers hovering over the colored pencils. She glanced at Ben as if seeking permission, though he'd already told her the supplies were hers. Her white blonde hair fell forward, partially hiding her face as she carefully selected a blue pencil. She held it like something precious, testing its point against her fingertip. The scratch of pencil against paper filled the quiet room. Ben pretended to read his book, but he couldn't help stealing glances at her concentrated expression. Her small hand moved with surprising confidence across the page, and her tongue poked out slightly at the corner of her mouth as she worked. Max wandered over, clutching his stuffed rabbit. Its ears were worn from constant handling, threads showing at the seams. He peered over Mia's shoulder, trying to see what she was drawing. She immediately tensed, using her arm to shield the paper from view. "No, Max," she whispered, nudging him away with her elbow. Max's lower lip trembled, but he retreated to his corner of the room, hugging his rabbit tighter. Hours passed, marked only by the ticking clock and the soft sounds of pencil strokes. Ben brought her a glass of water, setting it quietly beside her. She didn't acknowledge him, but she took small sips between colors, careful not to let any drops fall on her work. Finally, Mia set down her pencils, arranging them precisely in their box. She stared at her drawing for a long moment, then slowly slid it across the coffee table toward Ben. Her fingers lingered on the corner of the paper before letting go. His breath caught as he looked at the page. There they were, 3 figures drawn with careful detail. Him, taller than the others, wearing his Sunday sweater with the buttons she'd meticulously included. Max with his ever-present rabbit, its floppy ears perfectly captured. And Mia herself, standing slightly apart but still part of the group, her white hair a cascade of careful strokes. It wasn't perfect. The proportions were off, and the lines were wobbly in places. But it was them. Their family. Ben felt his throat tighten with emotion. He opened his mouth to speak, but before he could, something magical happened. Mia's lips curved upward in a small, hesitant smile. It was tiny, barely there, but it transformed her entire face. For just a moment, she looked like any other 7-year-old girl, proud of her artwork, her red eyes sparkling with achievement. Without saying a word, Ben stood up and walked to the mantel. He found an old frame tucked away in a drawer and carefully placed Mia's drawing inside, making sure it was perfectly centered. When he set it on the mantel, positioned where everyone could see it, Mia quickly looked away. But he caught the flash of pride in her eyes, the way she sat a little straighter, her shoulders relaxing slightly. She picked up another piece of paper and began to draw again, but this time, she didn't push Max away when he settled down beside her. Instead, she shifted slightly, making room for him and his rabbit as her pencil began to dance across the fresh page. Thunder cracked across the night sky, shaking the windows of Ben's house. The storm had rolled in suddenly, bringing with it sheets of rain that drummed against the roof like an army of impatient fingers. Ben was reading in his bedroom, trying to lose himself in the pages of an old novel, when he heard it, a small, frightened cry from down the hall. His heart jumped. Without thinking, he was on his feet, moving quickly toward the twins' room. Lightning flashed, illuminating the hallway in sharp bursts that cast strange, dancing shadows on the walls. Another crack of thunder, another muffled whimper that tugged at his chest. Ben pushed open their door to find Max huddled under his blanket, his small form trembling violently beneath the cotton shield. The stuffed rabbit was clutched to his chest, its floppy ears poking out from the covers, but it offered little comfort against the storm's fury. "Max?" Ben whispered, approaching slowly so as not to startle him. The boy's head poked out from under the covers, his pale face streaked with tears that glistened in the dim light. When the next thunderclap boomed overhead, rattling the window panes, Max let out a sob and reached for Ben instinctively, his arms stretching out in desperate need. Ben didn't hesitate. He gathered Max into his arms, feeling the boy's racing heartbeat flutter against his chest like a trapped bird. "Shh, it's okay," he murmured, rubbing small circles on Max's back, the way he remembered his own mother doing when he was small. "I've got you. You're safe." Max's fingers curled into Ben's shirt, holding on tight as if afraid he might disappear. His whole body shook with each rumble of thunder, but he pressed closer to Ben, seeking shelter in his embrace, his face buried in the crook of Ben's neck. Across the room, Mia sat rigid on her bed, her back pressed against the wall. Her breathing came in quick, shallow gasps, though she tried to hide it behind a mask of bravery. Her eyes were wide, tracking the lightning's shadows on the wall like a cornered animal. Ben could see her fighting the urge to show fear, to need comfort, her pride warring with her terror. "Mia," he said softly, holding out his free arm in quiet invitation. "There's room for you too." She didn't move at first, her internal struggle visible in the way she gripped her bedsheets, knuckles white with tension. Another crash of thunder made her jump, the sound seeming to shake the very foundations of the house. Then, as if something finally broke inside her, Mia slid off her bed and crossed the room on silent feet. After a moment's hesitation, she crawled into Ben's lap beside her brother, making herself small against his side. Ben's throat tightened as he held them both, emotion threatening to overwhelm him. Their small bodies trembled against him, but they were here, letting him comfort them, trusting him to keep them safe. Max's tears soaked into his shirt, while Mia's fingers found their way to his sleeve, holding on with quiet desperation. "The storm can't hurt you," he whispered, gently stroking their white blonde hair that seemed to glow with each flash of lightning. "I promise I won't let anything hurt you. Not ever." They sat like that as the storm raged outside, three hearts beating together in the darkness of the room. Neither child spoke, but their grip on him never loosened, as if they'd found an anchor in the storm. Gradually, their trembling subsided. Their breathing slowed, becoming deeper and more regular. One by one, they drifted off to sleep against his chest, finally feeling safe enough to let go of their fear. Ben held them close, his own eyes growing wet with unshed tears. This was the first time they'd truly let him in, the first time they'd sought comfort in his arms, instead of turning away. He didn't dare move, didn't want to break this precious moment of trust that felt as delicate as a soap bubble. So he stayed, listening to their soft breathing, feeling the weight of their small bodies against him, as the storm slowly rolled away into the night, leaving behind a silence filled with promise. Sunlight streamed through the kitchen windows, casting warm patches on the freshly mopped floor. The storm had passed, leaving behind puddles that sparkled in the morning light like scattered diamonds. Ben stood at the stove, whisking eggs in a bowl with practiced movements, when he heard the soft padding of feet behind him. He turned to find Mia, already dressed in her favorite blue sweater, pulling plates from the cabinet. His breath caught as she carefully arranged them on the table, placing forks and napkins beside each one with precise movements, as if following an invisible pattern. She'd never done this before, shown any interest in helping with meals or setting the table. Usually she kept to herself until called for breakfast. "Good morning," Ben said softly, not wanting to break whatever spell had fallen over the house. The morning felt delicate, precious. Mia glanced up briefly, then went back to straightening a fork that was slightly out of alignment. It wasn't quite a smile, but her face was softer than usual, the sharp edges of distrust beginning to blur. "Is it gonna rain again?" Max's voice carried from the doorway, still thick with sleep. His white blonde hair stuck up in wild directions, making him look like a sleepy dandelion. He rubbed his eyes with tiny fists, his pajama top slightly twisted. Ben chuckled. "Look at that bedhead, buddy. And no, I think the storm's passed. We should have sunshine all day." To his amazement, Max giggled, and tried to smooth down his hair with both hands. "Can we have pancakes? With chocolate chips, please?" "Already mixing the batter," Ben replied, his heart warming at how easily the conversation flowed. No more tense silences or fearful glances. The kitchen felt alive with possibility. Max climbed onto his chair, his feet swinging beneath him as he watched Ben pour batter onto the griddle. "Will they be round this time? Yesterday they looked like weird shapes." "Hey now," Ben pretended to be offended, placing a hand over his heart. "Those were artistic pancakes. I was being creative." Another laugh from Max, bright and clear like a bell, and even Mia's lips twitched in what might have been the beginning of a smile. She ducked her head, but not before Ben caught the glimmer in her eyes. The kitchen filled with the smell of coffee and breakfast, but it was more than that. The air felt different, lighter somehow, charged with quiet joy. Ben watched as Max chatted about a book he'd found on the shelf, something about dinosaurs and time travel, while Mia quietly poured orange juice into glasses, making sure each one had exactly the same amount. It hit him then, like a ray of sunshine breaking through clouds. This wasn't just his house anymore with two scared children living in it. Somewhere between last night's storm and this morning's sunshine, it had transformed into something else entirely. A home. He flipped the pancakes, stealing glances at his children. His children. The thought didn't feel strange anymore, didn't catch in his throat like it used to. When he looked over at Mia, she was watching him with those observant eyes of hers. But the wariness that had lived there since day one had softened into something else, something that looked a lot like acceptance, maybe even the first tentative seeds of trust. The afternoon sun painted long shadows across the porch as Ben wiped his hands on a dish towel, savoring the peaceful end to what had been a good day with the kids. The quiet contentment of their afternoon was shattered by 3 sharp knocks at the front door. Something about the sound, too harsh, too demanding, made his stomach clench with sudden unease. He opened the door and felt the air leave his lungs in a rush. A woman stood there, her pale blonde hair catching the sunlight in a way that seemed almost harsh. Her blue eyes, so much like Mia's, studied him coldly, calculating. The resemblance was unmistakable, and Ben's protective instincts flared instantly, every nerve in his body suddenly alert. "I'm their mother," she said without preamble, her voice as brittle as winter frost. "I want to see my kids." Behind him, Ben heard a small gasp that broke his heart. He turned slightly to see Max frozen in place, his beloved stuffed rabbit dangling limply from trembling fingers. Mia stood rigid beside him, her small hands curling into tight fists at her sides, knuckles white with tension. The raw fear in their eyes made Ben's heart ache with a fierce, protective pain. "Rachel," Mia whispered, the name coming out like poison, loaded with years of hurt and abandonment. Ben shifted his stance instinctively, placing himself more firmly between the children and their birth mother, making himself into a human shield. His pulse hammered in his ears as he watched Rachel's emotionless face. There was no warmth there, no motherly concern or regret for lost years, just cold determination that sent chills down his spine. "I made a mistake," Rachel announced flatly, as if discussing a minor inconvenience rather than abandoning her children for years. "I'll take them now." She said it casually, like she was picking up dry cleaning rather than trying to uproot 2 healing children's lives. The casual cruelty of her words made Ben's jaw clench so tight it hurt. These were the same children she had labeled as cursed, the ones she had thrown away without a second thought, leaving them to bounce between foster homes. Now that they had finally found stability and love, now that they were beginning to trust and heal, she wanted to claim them. The tension in the room was suffocating, thick enough to choke on until Mia's voice cut through it like a blade. She stepped forward, her small frame vibrating with anger and determination, standing straighter than Ben had ever seen her. "No," she said, her eyes fierce and unwavering as she stared at the woman who had abandoned her, her voice stronger than any child's should need to be. "We don't belong to you." The evening light faded through the windows as Rachel made herself at home on Ben's couch. Her presence filled the room like smoke, making it hard to breathe. Max pressed himself against the wall while Mia stood rigid, her small hands balled into fists. "I've been thinking about them," Rachel said, smoothing her designer jeans. "A mother never stops loving her children." Ben watched her carefully, noting how her eyes never quite landed on the twins. There was no warmth in her voice, no desperate longing of a mother who'd lost her babies. Just cool calculation. "Why now?" Ben asked, the words coming out sharper than he intended. "They've been in the system for 7 years. Rachel waved her hand dismissively. "Things are different now. I'm in a better place." She paused, examining her manicured nails. "I'm ready to be their mother." "You left us." Mia's voice cracked like thunder in the quiet room. Her pale face had gone red with anger, tears threatening to spill. "You said we were cursed. You didn't want us." Rachel's expression hardened. "You were too young to understand. Sometimes mothers have to make hard choices." Ben noticed Max shifting uncomfortably. The boy's eyes darted between Rachel and Mia, torn between his sister's rage and some deep, buried hope. Even after everything, a part of him still yearned for his mother's love. "They're my children," Rachel continued, as if stating a simple fact. "I gave birth to them. That means something." "It means nothing," Mia spat, but her voice trembled. Ben stepped closer to the twins, his presence steady and protective. "You can't just walk back into their lives and expect—" "I can do whatever I want," Rachel cut him off. "They're mine." She stood up, brushing at her jeans though there wasn't a speck of dust on them. Her lips curved into a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "I'll be back," she said, like it was already decided, like their lives were hers to rearrange. Mia's jaw clenched so tight Ben could hear her teeth grinding. Max seemed to shrink, making himself smaller against the wall. Ben's hands curled into fists at his sides, fighting back words that wouldn't help anyone. The morning sun struggled through heavy clouds, casting weak shadows across Ben's kitchen. Neither child had slept well. Dark circles ringed their eyes, and Max's stuffed rabbit showed signs of being clutched all night long. The usual breakfast chatter was replaced by silence, broken only by the soft clink of spoons against cereal bowls. Ben watched them, his heart aching. He'd spent the night researching adoption laws, making calls to lawyers, preparing for what he knew was coming. Rachel wouldn't just disappear. People like her never did. "Can we talk?" he asked softly, pushing his own untouched coffee aside. Mia's spine stiffened, but she nodded. Max just hugged his rabbit closer. They moved to the living room, where Ben sat on the floor to be at their eye level. "I need you both to understand something very important," he began, keeping his voice gentle but firm. "No one, not Rachel, not anyone, can take you away unless you want to go. You have a choice." "We're not going anywhere," Mia snapped, her pale face flushed with anger. Her hands gripped the hem of her sweater so tightly her knuckles turned white. "She left us. She threw us away." But Max shifted uncomfortably, his lower lip trembling. "But she's our mom," he whispered, not meeting anyone's eyes. "She said she made a mistake." Ben's chest tightened at the raw hope in Max's voice. He reached out slowly, making sure Max could see his movement, and placed a steady hand on the boy's shoulder. "Being a parent isn't about blood," he said softly. "It's about who stays. It's about who gets up in the middle of the night during thunderstorms, who makes sure you have enough to eat, who loves you even when it's hard." He looked at both children, letting his words sink in. Being a parent means choosing to be there, every single day. Mia's eyes glistened with unshed tears, but her chin remained lifted defiantly. Max clutched his rabbit tighter, conflict written across his young face. Outside, the first snow of the season began to fall, delicate flakes drifting past the window. Ben looked at these two children, his children, he realized with sudden clarity. Their pale hair, their uncertain smiles, their fierce hearts. They weren't just two kids he'd taken in anymore, they were his family. The knowledge settled in his chest. warm and certain. Whatever Rachel had planned, whatever battles lay ahead, he would face them. He would fight for them. The evening settled heavily around Ben's house, the crackling fireplace doing little to disperse the thick tension in the air. From his spot in the kitchen, Ben watched Mia's rigid posture as she stared into the dancing flames. Max sat beside her, his dinner growing cold, his beloved stuffed rabbit clutched tightly against his chest. The silence felt oppressive, broken only by the occasional pop of burning wood. Ben's heart ached as he noticed how Mia had retreated behind her walls again. Just yesterday she'd been setting the table, showing small signs of trust. Now her face was a mask, her shoulders stiff with tension. When he'd asked if she wanted more juice earlier, she'd barely nodded, those blue eyes distant and guarded. Max, who had finally started to relax around him, now kept his gaze fixed on the floor. His small fingers worked nervously at the rabbit's worn ears, a habit Ben had noticed emerged whenever the boy felt scared. The progress they'd made, the Uncle Ben, the shared laughter at breakfast, seemed to have evaporated like morning dew. Ben understood with painful clarity what was happening. Rachel's appearance had shaken their fragile sense of security. They were waiting for the other shoe to drop, for everything to fall apart. Just like it always had before. Unable to bear their silent suffering any longer, Ben moved from the kitchen and knelt beside them. The carpet was rough under his knees as he settled at their eye level, careful to give them enough space so they wouldn't feel trapped. "Listen to me," he said softly, keeping his voice steady despite the emotion threatening to crack it. "You're safe here. No one, not Rachel, not anyone, can take you away unless you want to go. This is your home for as long as you want it to be." Mia's jaw clenched, a spark of defiance finally breaking through her blank expression. "We don't want to go," she declared, her voice hard with determination. Her small hands balled into fists in her lap, as if ready to fight for her right to stay. Later that night, Ben tucked them into their beds. Real beds now, not the corner where they'd first insisted on sleeping. The nightlight cast soft shadows on the walls, and the house creaked gently around them. As Ben turned to leave, his hand on the doorknob, Max's voice stopped him. It was barely more than a whisper, fragile and frightened. "What if she comes back?" Ben's grip tightened on the doorknob, his knuckles turning white with the force of his determination. Rachel wouldn't take them away. Not now. Not ever. The kitchen was silent except for the soft scrape of forks against plates. Ben stood at the stove, flipping another batch of pancakes, stealing glances at Mia and Max. The morning light filtered weakly through the window, casting long shadows across their untouched breakfast plates. Mia sat ramrod straight in her chair, her white blonde hair falling like a curtain around her face. Her fingers gripped the edge of the table, knuckles white with tension. Max hunched beside her, pushing his scrambled eggs back and forth across his plate, making patterns but never lifting the fork to his mouth. "Would you like some more syrup?" Ben asked, trying to keep his voice light and casual. Mia's only response was a slight shake of her head. Max didn't even look up. Ben's chest tightened as he watched them. Just days ago they'd been making progress. Max had called him Uncle Ben, and Mia had smiled. Actually smiled. Now it felt like they were back at the beginning, waiting for the other shoe to drop. He set a fresh stack of pancakes on the table, the sweet smell of maple syrup filling the air. Neither child reached for them. "The weather's supposed to clear up later," Ben tried again. "Maybe we could—" Mia's shoulder twitched in what might have been a shrug. Max's fork scraped against his plate. Ben's heart ached as he recognized the familiar signs, the rigid postures, the silence, the way they seemed to be trying to make themselves as small as possible. They were preparing themselves, he realized, preparing for him to change his mind, to decide they were too much trouble, to send them back like everyone else had. He couldn't stand it anymore. Setting down his spatula, Ben pulled out a chair and sat down at the table. "I need you both to look at me for a minute." Slowly, reluctantly, two pairs of pale blue eyes met his. "I'm not going anywhere," he said firmly, making sure to meet each of their gazes. "And neither are you. What happened yesterday with Rachel, It doesn't change anything. This is your home now, if you want it to be. Max's lower lip trembled slightly. Mia's fingers tightened on the table edge. I know you're scared, Ben continued softly. I know you're waiting for me to change my mind. But I won't. You're stuck with me, whether you like it or not. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken fears and fragile hope. Then slowly, deliberately, Mia reached for her fork. She cut off a small piece of pancake and lifted it to her mouth. After watching his sister take the first bite, Max followed suit, picking up his own fork with trembling fingers. Ben's throat tightened as he watched them eat. It wasn't much, just a few small bites, but it was a start. A tiny step forward on the long road to trust. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the snow-covered park, the pristine white blanket untouched except for their footprints. Ben walked ahead, his breath visible in the cold air, while Mia and Max trailed several steps behind. Their usual whispered conversations were absent, replaced by a heavy silence that had lingered since Rachel's visit. Ben's heart ached as he watched them. Max kept his eyes fixed on the ground, his stuffed rabbit clutched tightly to his chest. Mia's face was set in its familiar mask of careful neutrality, her eyes darting around as if searching for threats. Stopping near a small hill, Ben bent down and gathered some snow in his gloved hands. He packed it loosely, then tossed it gently at Max's feet. The soft puff of white scattered across his boots. Max jumped slightly, his eyes widening in surprise. For a moment, he just stared at the scattered snow. Then, hesitantly, he reached down and scooped up a handful. His throw was tentative, the snowball barely reaching Ben's knee, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes, a spark of playfulness that had been missing for days. Ben turned to Mia, another snowball ready. She tensed, her eyes narrowing as she assessed the situation. For a second, Ben worried he'd made a mistake. Then, unexpectedly, a small smirk tugged at the corner of her mouth. Before he could react, she'd already launched a perfectly aimed snowball at his chest. Direct hit. Ben laughed, stumbling backward dramatically. Max giggled, actually giggled, and soon the air was filled with flying snow and breathless laughter. Mia darted behind a tree, emerging to pelt Ben with rapid-fire snowballs. Max abandoned his stuffed rabbit on a nearby bench, his previous hesitation forgotten as he joined in the battle. Their laughter echoed across the empty park, pure and unreserved. Ben's heart swelled as he watched them. Mia's careful mask had cracked, replaced by genuine joy. Max moved with newfound energy, his earlier withdrawal forgotten. For these precious moments, they weren't traumatized children fearing abandonment. They were just kids playing in the snow. Mia and Max teamed up, launching a coordinated attack that left Ben covered in snow. Their cheeks were flushed from cold and excitement, their eyes bright with mischief. Ben fell backward into the snow, declaring their victory with exaggerated groans of defeat. As they caught their breath, Ben watched his children, his heart full of love for these remarkable, resilient kids who were slowly learning to trust again. This was what childhood should be: laughter, play, and the absolute certainty that you were loved and protected. The sound of their giggles carried on the winter wind was the sweetest music he'd ever heard. The evening settled around them like a soft blanket, the crackling fire casting dancing shadows across the living room walls. Max had fallen asleep on the couch, his stuffed rabbit clutched tightly to his chest. Mia stood alone by the fireplace, her pale hair glowing orange in the firelight. Her thin frame was rigid, shoulders tense, as she stared into the flames with an intensity that made her seem older than her 7 years. Ben watched her from the doorway, noting how the firelight caught the determination in her stance. She reminded him so much of himself, carrying burdens too heavy for such young shoulders. Quietly, he crossed the room and lowered himself to sit on the hearth beside her, careful to leave enough space between them. The silence stretched between them, broken only by the soft pops and crackles of burning wood and Max's gentle breathing from the couch. Ben didn't push or prod. He'd learned that with Mia, patience was everything. She would speak when she was ready. Minutes ticked by. Then, without turning her gaze from the flames, Mia's voice came out barely above a whisper. "Was your baby a girl or a boy?" The question caught Ben off guard, making his breath catch in his throat. A familiar ache bloomed in his chest, the one that never really went away. He hadn't expected this question, hadn't been prepared for the way it would make his heart clench. He swallowed hard, forcing himself to answer honestly. "A girl." Mia didn't respond immediately. Her eyes remained fixed on the dancing flames, but Ben could see something shift in her expression, a flicker of understanding, of shared pain. She knew what it meant to lose someone, to be left behind. Even at her young age, she understood loss in a way no child should have to. The fire popped loudly, sending a spark flying up the chimney. Mia tracked it with her eyes until it disappeared. Then, slowly, deliberately, she shifted her weight. Just slightly, just enough that her shoulder pressed against Ben's arm. It was the smallest of gestures, but coming from Mia, it felt monumental. Ben remained perfectly still, hardly daring to breathe. Like a wild bird that had finally chosen to land nearby, he knew any sudden movement might send her retreating back behind her walls. So he simply sat there, letting her lean against him, sharing the warmth of the fire and the weight of understanding that passed between them. The firelight cast long shadows across their faces as Ben and Mia sat in companionable silence. Her small frame remained pressed against his arm, a gesture of trust that made his heart ache with tenderness. The crackling flames filled the quiet moments between them, until Ben found the courage to speak. "Her name was Sarah," he said softly, his voice steady despite the familiar tightness in his chest. "My wife. She loved to sing. That lullaby you were humming the other night? It was her favorite." Mia's shoulders tensed slightly, but she didn't pull away. Her eyes remained fixed on the dancing flames as Ben continued. "We were so excited about the baby." Sarah had already picked out names, started painting the nursery. His hands tightened into fists in his lap, knuckles white with remembered grief. But there were complications. We lost them both. The fire popped, sending sparks up the chimney. Mia turned her head slightly, studying his face with those piercing blue eyes. For the first time, she wasn't looking at him as someone who might leave, but as someone who understood what it meant to have your world torn apart. Soft footsteps padded across the carpet and Max appeared, rubbing his eyes sleepily. Without hesitation, he climbed into Ben's lap, his stuffed rabbit dangling from one hand. Ben's arms automatically wrapped around the boy, providing the warmth and safety Max sought. The silence stretched between them, comfortable yet heavy with unspoken emotions. Then Mia's voice came, barely above a whisper. "Did it hurt less?" Ben looked down at her, seeing the raw vulnerability in her question. She wasn't just asking about his loss. She was asking about her own, about the pain of being abandoned, of being called cursed, of never being wanted. "Not at first," he answered honestly, his voice gentle. "For a long time, I thought nothing would ever feel right again." He paused, looking at both children. Max curled trustingly in his lap, Mia pressed against his side. "But then I met you." Mia's breath caught slightly. She didn't speak, but her head slowly came to rest against his arm, the tension gradually leaving her small frame. It was such a tiny gesture, but Ben knew it meant everything. In that moment, they weren't just three people thrown together by circumstance. They were becoming something more. Ben paused in the kitchen doorway, the sight before him making his breath catch. Mia stood at the dining table, carefully placing plates in their proper spots. One for him, one for Max, and one for herself. Her movements were deliberate, almost ceremonial, as she lined up the forks and arranged the napkins just so. The warm aroma of roasted chicken filled the air, but it was Mia's simple act of setting the table that made the house feel truly like home for the first time. Ben's chest tightened with emotion, but he kept his expression neutral, not wanting to spook her with too much attention. Max appeared beside him, his stuffed rabbit tucked under one arm. The boy's eyes darted between his sister and Ben, understanding passing across his young face. He shuffled forward, and without a word, began helping Mia by placing glasses at each setting. Ben busied himself with bringing the food to the table, sneaking glances at the children as they worked together. The silence wasn't heavy anymore. It felt comfortable, almost peaceful. "Dinner's ready," Ben said softly, setting down the chicken. They took their seats, and something felt different. The usual tension that accompanied their meals was missing, replaced by something warmer. Mia served herself some potatoes, then passed the bowl to Max. Her movements were more relaxed, less guarded. When she finished arranging her food, she looked up at Ben. "How was church today?" she asked quietly. Ben nearly dropped his fork. In all their time together, she had never asked him about his day. The question hung in the air like a precious gift, one he needed to handle with care. "It was good," he replied, keeping his voice steady despite the emotion threatening to overwhelm him. Mrs. Johnson brought her famous apple pie for the social hour. Max perked up at the mention of pie, and Ben caught the ghost of a smile on Mia's face. They continued eating, the conversation flowing more naturally than ever before. Mia asked another question about the church members, and Max chimed in with his own observations about their neighbors. As they finished dinner, Ben stood to clear the table. Mia rose too, gathering plates with careful hands. Their eyes met briefly as she handed him a stack of dishes. This time, she didn't quickly look away as she always had before. Instead, she held his gaze for a moment, something new and trusting in her expression. Ben accepted the dishes, his heart full. The kitchen was warm with more than just the lingering heat from cooking. It was warm with the feeling of family, slowly but surely coming together. Golden morning light spilled through the curtains, casting long shadows across the living room floor. Mia and Max stood side by side at the window, their breath fogging the glass as they watched snowflakes dance in the crisp morning air. It was the first real snowfall of the season, transforming their world into a pristine white blanket. Ben paused in the doorway, coffee mug warming his hands. Instead of looking at the snow, he found himself watching the twins. Their faces held a childlike wonder he hadn't seen before, pure and unguarded. Max pressed his small hand against the cold window pane, while Mia's eyes tracked each falling flake with quiet fascination. "Can we go outside?" Max's voice was soft but eager, breaking the peaceful silence. He turned to Ben with hopeful eyes, his usual hesitation forgotten in the excitement of the moment. Ben set his coffee down. "Let's bundle up first." They pulled on winter coats, mittens, and boots. Max could barely contain his enthusiasm as Ben helped him with his zipper. Even Mia seemed to vibrate with subtle energy as she tugged on her hat. The morning air was crisp and clean as they stepped outside. Max immediately flopped backward into the fresh snow, spreading his arms and legs to make a snow angel. His laughter, clear and uninhibited, rang through the quiet morning. Mia watched for a moment before joining him, her own movements more careful, but just as joyful. Together, they built a slightly lopsided snowman. Ben found an old scarf and a hat, while Max insisted on using twigs for the arms. Mia carefully placed stones for the eyes and mouth, stepping back to study their work with serious consideration. The snowball fight started when Max accidentally threw a loose handful of snow at Ben's back. Before long, all three were ducking and dodging, their laughter echoing across the yard. Ben deliberately missed most of his throws, delighting in the twins' triumphant giggles as they pelted him with snowballs. Finally, breathless and red-cheeked from the cold and exertion, they collapsed in the snow. Ben watched as Mia and Max caught their breath, their eyes bright with joy. The moment felt perfect, until Mia's expression suddenly turned serious. She turned to Ben, her blue eyes intense. "Can we stay here forever?" Her voice wavered slightly, but her gaze remained steady. Ben's heart seemed to stop for a moment. He knelt in the snow before them, taking their small hands in his. "Always," he promised, his voice thick with emotion. "This is your home for as long as you want it to be." A single tear slipped down Mia's cheek, but she quickly wiped it away with her mittened hand. Then, in a movement that took Ben completely by surprise, she threw her arms around him. It was their first real hug. a moment of pure trust that made his heart swell almost painfully in his chest. Twinkling lights cast a magical glow over the Christmas tree lot, reflecting off the fresh snow. Ben watched as Mia and Max wandered between the rows of evergreens, their boots crunching in the snow. The air smelled of pine and wood smoke from the lot owner's fire barrel. "Can we get this one?" Max tugged Ben's sleeve, pointing at a towering tree that must have been 12 feet tall. "It's the biggest." "It won't fit in the house," Mia said practically, her breath visible in the cold air. She moved methodically through the rows, studying each tree with intense concentration. "But bigger is better," Max protested, bouncing on his toes. Ben smiled, letting them lead the way. Just weeks ago, they'd been too afraid to voice any opinions. Now they were arguing like regular siblings, comfortable enough to disagree. "This one's crooked," Mia declared, moving past a perfectly good tree. "And that one has a hole in the middle." Max groaned dramatically. "They're all good, just pick one." "It has to be right," Mia insisted, her face serious. She stopped suddenly in front of a 7-foot spruce. It wasn't the fullest tree or the most perfectly shaped, but something about it caught her attention. She circled it slowly, examining every branch. Then she looked at Ben and said quietly, "This one feels right." Ben's heart swelled. It was the first time she'd made a choice without hesitation, without looking to him or Max for approval first. Back home, they spread boxes of ornaments across the living room floor. Max tangled himself in a string of lights, giggling as Ben helped him escape. Mia carefully arranged each ornament, making sure the spacing was perfect. "Hot chocolate?" Ben asked, and both kids nodded eagerly. They sat on the couch afterward, admiring their work. The tree glowed warmly, casting colored shadows on the walls. Max had insisted on using every color of lights they owned. Mia had carefully hung the delicate glass balls Ben had stored away years ago. "It's pretty," Max whispered, his face illuminated by the twinkling lights. Mia nodded, sipping her hot chocolate. For once, she didn't look guarded or worried. She looked content. Ben watched them both, these children who had transformed his empty house into something else entirely. Their laughter echoed off the walls now. Their artwork hung on the refrigerator. Their shoes sat by the door. Somewhere along the way, without him even noticing, his house had become a home. The Christmas tree lights cast dancing shadows across the living room walls, creating a magical atmosphere that should have felt peaceful. Yet there sat Mia, her small frame curled tightly on the couch, arms wrapped around her knees as if holding herself together. Her pale hair caught the colored lights, making her look almost ethereal in the darkness. The house was quiet except for the soft ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner. Upstairs, Max had fallen asleep hours ago, worn out from the excitement of decorating their first Christmas tree. But Mia couldn't seem to let her guard down enough to rest. Ben noticed her absence during his final check of the house. He paused in the doorway, watching her for a moment. Her eyes were fixed on the twinkling lights, but he could tell her mind was somewhere else entirely. Without saying anything, he walked over and settled onto the other end of the couch, careful to give her space. Mia didn't acknowledge him at first. She kept her arms wrapped tightly around herself, as if preparing for some invisible blow. The silence stretched between them, broken only by the occasional crackle from the dying fire. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "What if you get tired of us?" The question hit Ben like a physical pain in his chest. He carefully placed his hand on the armrest between them, not reaching for her, just letting her know he was there. His throat felt tight as he thought about all the times she must have been rejected, all the homes that had given up on her and Max. "That's not possible," he said softly but firmly. "You're mine, forever." He watched as Mia's fingers tightened around her knees. She wanted to believe him. He could see it in the way her shoulders trembled slightly, in how she blinked rapidly at the Christmas lights. But years of rejection had taught her not to trust in forever, not to believe in unconditional love. The silence returned, heavy with unspoken fears and hopes. Ben remained still, letting her process his words at her own pace. He knew pushing too hard would only make her retreat further into herself. After what felt like an eternity, Mia moved. She reached for the thick blanket draped over the back of the couch. For a moment, Ben thought she was going to wrap it around herself, another barrier between them. Instead, she slowly, carefully spread it out, making sure it covered both of them. Ben's heart swelled at this small gesture. Coming from Mia, it was more meaningful than any words could have been. It was her way of saying, "I want to trust you," without having to voice the vulnerability out loud. They sat there together under the shared blanket, watching the Christmas lights twinkle against the darkness. Neither spoke, but the silence was different now, softer, warmer, full of possibility. The morning sun streamed through the kitchen windows, casting warm patches of light across the wooden floor. Ben stood at the stove, spatula in hand, as the sweet scent of cinnamon and coffee filled the air. For once, he didn't have to call the kids to breakfast. They were already there, settled at the table as if they'd been doing this their whole lives. Max swung his legs under his chair, his voice animated as he described the snowman he wanted to build later. "Can we make him really tall? Like taller than you?" His blue eyes sparkled with excitement, no trace of the fear that used to shadow them. "Sure, buddy," Ben replied, carefully flipping a pancake. "We might need to find a ladder, though." Mia sat quietly beside her brother, but it wasn't the tense silence of before. She seemed relaxed, present in a way she hadn't been since arriving. Her fingers traced patterns on the tablecloth as she listened to Max's plans, occasionally nodding or rolling her eyes at his more outlandish ideas. Ben poured more batter onto the griddle, trying to maintain his focus despite the warmth spreading through his chest. These simple moments, just being together, no pressure, no expectations, felt like miracles. "Oh, shoot," he muttered, as smoke rose from one particularly dark pancake. He quickly scraped it off the griddle, fumbling with the spatula in his haste. "Well, that one's definitely not going on anyone's plate." Then it happened. A sound so unexpected, so precious, it made Ben freeze mid-motion. Mia giggled. Not a polite laugh, not a forced one, but a genuine, spontaneous giggle that lit up her entire face. Her hand flew to her mouth as if surprised by her own reaction, but her eyes danced with amusement. Ben's heart soared, but he kept his expression casual, fighting back the tears that threatened to form. "What?" he asked, grinning at her as he pretended to be offended by her amusement. Mia shook her head, a smile still playing at the corners of her mouth. "Nothing," she said softly, but her eyes remained warm, fixed on him without their usual guardedness. Max looked between them, a grin spreading across his face as he caught the playful mood. "That pancake looks like it got attacked by a dragon," he declared, which only made Mia's smile grow wider. Ben turned back to the stove, his hands slightly shaking as he poured the next batch of batter. Behind him, the conversation continued naturally, Max's chatter, the soft clink of forks against plates, and most precious of all, the lingering warmth of Mia's laughter still hanging in the air. He'd heard people say that some battles are won in a single moment. As he flipped another pancake, this one perfectly golden, Ben knew with absolute certainty that he'd just won the most important battle of his life, not with force or grand gestures, but with burnt pancakes and morning light and the sound of his daughter's first real laugh. The Christmas tree lights twinkled in the cozy living room, casting dancing shadows on the walls. The scent of freshly baked cookies mingled with the sharp pine fragrance of the tree, creating that unmistakable Christmas Eve magic. Ben sat on the floor near the tree, his heart thumping with nervous excitement as he pulled out 2 small packages wrapped in red paper. Max bounced on his toes, barely containing his enthusiasm, while Mia perched on the edge of the couch, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. The fire crackled softly in the background, its warmth reaching out to embrace them all. "I thought you might like to open one present tonight," Ben said, his voice gentle as he handed each child a package. "It's a Christmas Eve tradition." Max tore into his immediately, paper flying everywhere, but Mia held hers carefully, as if it might disappear if she moved too quickly. Her fingers traced the edges of the wrapping paper, memorizing its shape. Inside each package was a pair of mittens, soft, warm, and clearly handmade. Max's were blue with white snowflakes, while Mia's were purple with silver stars. The stitches weren't perfect, showing the careful but unpracticed hand that had created them. "Cool," Max exclaimed, pulling his on right away. He flexed his fingers inside them, grinning from ear to ear. "They're so warm." Mia stared at hers, running her thumb over the slightly uneven stitches. Her voice was barely above a whisper when she asked, "You made these?" Ben nodded, his throat tight with emotion. "Of course," he replied softly. "Every stitch." He didn't mention the countless YouTube tutorials he'd watched, the many failed attempts or the hours spent practicing until his fingers ached. He just watched as Mia processed this information. She held the mittens like they were made of glass, examining each careful stitch. Then slowly, she slipped them onto her hands. They fit perfectly, as if they had been made specifically for her, which, of course, they had been. Max was already running around the room, showing off his mittened hands to his stuffed rabbit. But Mia sat still, flexing her fingers inside the warm wool, her eyes fixed on the careful pattern of stars. The Christmas tree lights reflected off her pale hair as she looked up at Ben. Her blue eyes were wide, filled with an emotion he couldn't quite read. Then, in a voice so quiet he almost missed it, she whispered, "Thank you." 2 simple words, but they hit Ben like a physical force. In all these months, through all their progress, she had never said thank you to him. Not once. He swallowed hard, fighting back tears as he nodded in acknowledgement. The fire popped loudly in the fireplace, and Max laughed at something his rabbit had apparently done, but Ben barely noticed. He was too caught up in this moment, in these 2 words that meant everything. They weren't just thanks for the mittens, they were thanks for everything. For choosing them, for staying, for proving that love could be real and permanent. Ben knelt beside his bed, his knees pressing into the worn carpet. The soft glow from the Christmas tree in the hallway cast dancing shadows on the walls. His hands, usually steady, trembled slightly as he clasped them together. It had been so long since he'd prayed, really prayed, not just going through the motions during Sunday service. The words came slowly at first, barely a whisper. "Lord ... His voice caught. He cleared his throat and tried again. "Lord, I know I've been angry. I know I've questioned everything since Sarah." He paused, taking a deep breath. "But tonight, I need to thank you. For Mia and Max. For showing me that love isn't finished with me yet." Tears pricked at his eyes as he continued. "They're so precious, Lord. So hurt, but so brave. Mia, with her fierce heart and careful smiles. Max, with his gentle spirit and growing trust." His voice grew stronger, more certain. "Thank you for bringing them to me. For letting me be their father." The Christmas tree lights twinkled through the crack under his door, reminding him of stars. "Please," he whispered, "let them always know they're loved. Let them never doubt it again. Help me be the father they deserve." For the first time in years, the weight of grief felt lighter. Prayer didn't feel like an empty ritual anymore. It felt like coming home. A soft knock interrupted his thoughts. It was so quiet he almost missed it. The gentlest tap against his door. "Come in," he called softly, wiping his eyes as he stood up. The door creaked open slowly, and Mia's pale face appeared in the gap. She stood there in her new Christmas pajamas, looking smaller than usual. Her white blonde hair glowed in the Christmas lights, making her look almost ethereal. "Can't sleep?" Ben asked gently. She shook her head, fidgeting with the hem of her pajama top. She started, then stopped. Her eyes darted around the room before settling back on him. "Can I stay with you for a little while?" Ben's heart swelled. Without hesitation, he opened his arms. "Of course you can, sweetheart." For a moment, Mia stood frozen in the doorway. Then, like a dam breaking, she crossed the room and curled up against his side. Her small body trembled slightly, but she didn't pull away. Instead, she pressed closer, as if finally allowing herself to accept comfort. Ben wrapped his arms around her, holding her gently but securely. He could feel her heart beating fast against his chest, could feel the way she gradually relaxed as he held her. It was a moment of pure trust, something he'd been waiting for since the day he brought her home. Ben stirred from sleep, his ears catching the faint sound of whispers and stifled giggles. For a moment he lay still, wondering if his mind was playing tricks on him. But there it was again, the unmistakable sound of small feet trying their best to be quiet. He pushed himself up, following the sounds to the living room. The Christmas tree lights cast a warm glow across the room, creating dancing shadows on the walls. Through the window, he could see fresh snow blanketing the world outside, untouched and pristine in the pre-dawn light. Max crouched near the tree, his stuffed rabbit clutched in one hand while the other reached tentatively toward a wrapped present. Mia stood behind him, her white blonde hair almost glowing in the tree lights, attempting to shush her brother with limited success. "Shh, Max. You'll wake him up," she whispered, though her own eyes kept darting to the presents. Ben watched from the doorway, his heart so full it felt like it might burst. This was what Christmas should be, children too excited to sleep, the magic of anticipation filling the air. He cleared his throat softly, and both kids whirled around, caught but not afraid. "Merry Christmas," he said softly, and Max's face broke into a wide grin. "Can we open them?" Max asked, bouncing on his toes. "Please?" Ben nodded, settling onto the floor beside them. Max dove for his presents while Mia moved more carefully, selecting each gift with deliberate attention. When Max unwrapped the book he'd been eyeing in the store window for weeks, his eyes went wide with joy. "You remembered," he exclaimed, hugging it to his chest. But it was Mia's reaction to her gift that made Ben's throat tight. She carefully unwrapped the small box, lifting the lid to reveal a delicate silver bracelet. Her name was engraved on it in flowing script. Her fingers traced the letters slowly, reverently. "It's the first thing that's ever belonged just to me," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. Ben knelt beside her, gently taking her hands in his. "You belong here, Mia. Always." She stared at the bracelet for a long moment, then slowly fastened it around her wrist. For the first time since she'd arrived, she didn't question the gift or look for hidden meanings. She simply accepted it, accepted that it was hers, accepted that she belonged. Max was already flipping through his book, showing his stuffed rabbit the pictures, while Mia's fingers kept returning to touch the bracelet, as if making sure it was still there. Ben watched them both, these children who had changed his life in ways he never expected, and silently thanked God for bringing them to him. Ben sips his coffee, watching Mia and Max explore their Christmas presents scattered across the living room floor. The fire crackles softly, casting a warm glow over their faces as they examine each gift with careful attention. Wrapping paper litters the carpet, and the Christmas tree lights twinkle steadily in the corner. Max suddenly jumps up, his eyes bright with excitement. He reaches under the tree, pulling out a small envelope that had been hidden behind other presents. His hands shake slightly as he approaches Ben, a shy smile playing on his lips. "We made this," Max says quietly, holding out the envelope. Ben sets down his coffee cup, his heart already beating faster. The envelope is slightly crumpled, showing signs of being handled many times. He opens it carefully, aware of both children watching him intently. Inside is a handmade card. The edges are uneven, cut with children's scissors. Colorful drawings decorate the front, what looks like 3 stick figures holding hands under a bright yellow sun. But it's when Ben opens the card that his heart stops completely. There, written in Max's shaky handwriting, is a single word that changes everything. Daddy. Ben's vision blurs immediately. His hands tremble as he holds the card, and he feels his throat tighten with emotion. He tries to speak, but no words come out. Years of grief, months of uncertainty, and weeks of careful hope all crash together in this one moment. Beside him, Mia shifts on the couch. Her fingers play with the hem of her sweater, a nervous habit she's never quite broken. She bites her lip, looking first at the card, then at Ben's face. For a moment, she seems to wrestle with something inside herself. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she says, "Merry Christmas, Dad." The dam breaks. Ben's tears fall freely now, dropping onto the card in his hands. He pulls both children into his arms, holding them close as his body shakes with sobs. These aren't tears of sadness or loss. They're tears of joy, of completion, of coming home. Max burrows into his chest while Mia, usually so careful with physical contact, wraps her arms around his neck. For the first time since losing his wife, Ben lets himself cry completely, openly, without holding anything back. In this moment, surrounded by wrapping paper and Christmas lights, holding his children, he is finally, truly whole. The afternoon sun streamed through the courthouse windows, casting long shadows across the polished floor. Ben sat between Mia and Max on the wooden bench, his heart thundering in his chest. The courtroom felt both too big and too small at the same time, its high ceilings and formal atmosphere making everything feel more intense. Max couldn't stay still, his small body practically vibrating with energy. He kept reaching up to adjust the tie Ben had helped him put on that morning. Mia, on the other hand, sat perfectly straight, her face a mask of careful control. But her fingers were wrapped tightly around Ben's sleeve, betraying her emotions. The judge, an older man with kind eyes, carefully reviewed the papers before him. Each shuffle of paper seemed to echo in the quiet room. Ben could feel both children tense with each sound. "Is this when it becomes real?" Max whispered, his voice carrying more than he intended in the quiet room. A few people smiled, but Max didn't notice, his eyes fixed on the judge. Ben reached over and squeezed Max's hand, unable to find his voice to answer. His throat felt too tight, too full of emotion. Finally, the judge looked up, a warm smile spreading across his face. The moment seemed to stretch forever as he cleared his throat. "It is my great honor," the judge began, his voice clear and strong, "to declare that Mia and Max Carter are legally the children of Benjamin Carter." The words hung in the air like a physical thing. Mia's fingers tightened around Ben's sleeve until he could feel her nails through the fabric. She swallowed hard, her chest rising and falling rapidly. Max's eyes went wide. "We're really staying? Forever?" he whispered, looking up at Ben with a mix of hope and disbelief. Ben managed to find his voice, though it came out rough with emotion. "Forever," he promised, wrapping an arm around each of them. The judge's gavel came down, the sound echoing through the courtroom like a final seal on their new life together. Papers were signed, congratulations were given, but Ben barely registered any of it. His entire world had narrowed to the two children pressed against his sides. As they stood to leave, Mia looked up at him. Her eyes were swimming with tears, but for once she didn't try to hide them. A small, genuine smile curved her lips. "Okay," she said softly, and Ben felt his heart swell. It wasn't just acceptance, it was trust, hope, and love all wrapped up in that single word. It was everything they'd been working toward since that first day at the orphanage. The evening settled softly around Ben's house, wrapping it in a blanket of peaceful quiet. The fire crackled in the living room hearth, casting warm shadows on the walls. The adoption papers sat on the coffee table, official and final. Their family was real now, in every way that mattered. Ben carried a sleepy Max up the stairs, the boy's head heavy against his shoulder. Max's stuffed rabbit dangled from his small hand, swaying with each step. The child had barely made it through dinner, the excitement of the day finally catching up to him. "Time for bed, buddy," Ben whispered, laying Max down gently. The boy curled up immediately, clutching his rabbit close. His white blonde hair splayed across the pillow like a halo, and Ben's heart swelled at the peaceful expression on his son's face. His son. The word felt right. Perfect. Mia stood in the doorway watching. She'd been quiet since they'd left the courthouse, but it wasn't her usual guarded silence. This was different, thoughtful, processing. She walked into the room as Ben pulled Max's blanket up to his chin. Ben turned to leave, expecting Mia to follow her usual routine of climbing into bed without a word. But tonight was different. Her small hand reached out, catching his larger one. Her fingers were warm, trusting. "Good night, Dad," she said softly, the word falling from her lips without hesitation or fear. No more Ben or Uncle Ben, just Dad. Simple, pure, and more powerful than any prayer he'd ever spoken. Ben's heart caught in his throat. He squeezed her hand gently, fighting back the tears that threatened to spill. "Good night, sweetheart," he managed, his voice thick with emotion. She didn't pull away immediately. For a moment, they stood there, connected by more than just their joined hands. Connected by love, by choice, by the understanding that they belonged to each other now, truly, completely, forever. When Ben finally stepped out of the room and closed the door, he leaned against it, overwhelmed by the fullness in his heart. Through the window at the end of the hall, he could see snow falling softly, each flake catching the moonlight. Inside, the house was warm, safe, filled with the quiet breathing of his children, his family. For the first time in years, Ben Carter knew he would sleep peacefully. The empty spaces in his heart, once hollow with grief, were now filled with something new, something precious. His family was complete. If you enjoyed the story of Max, I handpicked this next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.